In 1927, a fellow by the name of Walter Peck was walking a trail outside of Seligman, Arizona, heading to a local poker game when he almost fell into a funnel-shaped hole, of which when he looked down he could not see the bottom. The following day, he returned with his buddies who lured him in by rope. At a depth of 50 feet, he found two skeletons and the remains of a saddle, which he assumed were probably some kind of Neanderthals, cavemen dwellers. Later it was determined that they were not Neanderthals. They were the bodies of two Native American Indians who had been searching for wood during 1918 and had died of the Spanish influenza. The rest of their party had thrown their bodies down the hole in order to keep from infecting the rest of the community. Upon reaching a depth of 150 feet and standing on the cavern floor, George Peck waved his lantern around and saw sparkly items which he thought were gold and diamonds. He ran to the town in order to stake a mining claim. Unfortunately, they weren't valuable. But with the mining claim came mineral rights and the right to access the caverns. Peck began giving tours and luring people in by a rope and turnstile, a process which was hazardous and became known as dope on a rope. But there were no recorded fatalities doing this. In 1935, Peck cut a deal with the Civilian Conservation Corps and Work Projects Administration to furnish the materials and them the labor to enlarge and make easy access to the entrance. They built a staircase, several ladders, and a beautiful swinging suspension bridge out of this process. Keep that in mind for later on. Thus gave birth to the Coconino Caverns. Now called the Grand Canyon Caverns, the caverns have undergone two other name changes in between. About a mile down the hill from here, and next to Route 66, lies the Grand Canyon Caverns Motel, but the gift and tourist shop here lies directly over the opening to the caverns. In front of the gift shop lies a display of the old dope in a rope scenario as a tribute to Walter Peck. As far as legend and paranormal activity is concerned, an apparition has supposedly been sighted inside of the elevator, both on the gift shop level and on the cavern level, and is assumed to be Walter Peck, although it is acknowledged that he did not die here and that he relinquished his ownership of the property many years earlier. A caveat to that legend says that it might not be Walter, it might be his son. And a third variation says that it might be someone who committed suicide during the Cold War era when they began storing civil defense supplies in here. Whatever, there is a persistent rumor of someone hanging themselves in the caverns. Somehow, Walter Peck lost his ownership of the caverns. The rumor is that he gambled it away. The next owner to acquire the property was Winston Wright. He dug the elevator shaft to the caverns, built this beautiful curio shop and restaurant and even a small museum, and even the bunkhouse of which we're about ready to stay. Supposedly, when he decided to sell out to a corporation, Winston's oldest son was so angry over the transaction of the deal that he hung himself in the very bunkhouse of which we are about ready to stay. Hanging, hanging, hanging. Always by hanging. As of the time of this video production, you could do as we did, and you can rent this bunkhouse and do a nighttime tour of the caverns on any night when the suite has not been already reserved for a little over $300. You can spend all the time investigating that you want, but you can't use the suite facilities that are actually inside of the caverns. For that, you have to fork over another $500. The bunkhouse would easily sleep 8 to 10 people, although it was in a little bit of state of disrepair and needed a good cleaning, and that's supposing they can find the keys to it.
This seems like crazy.
Could you find our keys?
No, they're in here. I don't know how to work this thing, and she was trying to help.
This is the largest investigation that we have ever done, and in order to facilitate it, I enlisted the aid of two friends, Gene and Laura, to come with us and help set the equipment up. We are going to run two surveillance setups, one in the bunkhouse and one in the caverns. The caverns alone are the distance of 2 football fields. This is the first time that we have ever used other investigators on a hunt with us. As Jean and I go about setting up the equipment, Laura shows Jan the exact spot where she thinks is most likely that Winston Wright's son hung himself. This surveillance unit is not equipped with audio. We put 4 cameras up, 3 covering the area where we felt the suicide might have occurred at, and 1 in the kitchen area pointed down the hallway. This investigation in December, it was very cold, very windy, with a light snow. Once we got the room heated up and the surveillance unit set up, we headed for the caverns. Our ghost tour guide took us out to where the original entrance of the caverns was and gave us a brief history explanation of what they knew it to be.
1927, he thought he found cavemen. He didn't. It was actually Native Americans who had died in 1917 when they were out looking for firewood or something. Like a flu or something, and they didn't want to take it back to their village, and they couldn't dig a grave because the grounds were frozen. And they knew about the hole. They didn't know what was down under the ground, but they knew about the hole, so they lowered them down like 50 feet, and to them that's a proper burial. So after they finished building the elevator, the Indian tribe requested that we fill in the hole, because to them it's a burial ground for them. So
Right.
that's why they actually filled it in.
Well, that's not exactly the truth. In fact, if we trace out what documents are left, we find it's not accurate at all. Starting at the beginning, original owner Walter Peck lists his birthday as March 30th, 1883 on his World War I draft registration card from 1918. While he lists his nearest relative in Yuma, the form was actually filed in Prescott. The census records in 1910 show him living with his parents in Carrizozo, New Mexico, where by 1920 he had relocated to Yuma. The 1920 census shows him being married to a woman whose name is listed only as J.M. So by the time he arrived in Prescott, he was apparently a transient. What became of the first wife is unknown. But in 1923, he married his second wife, Lorraine, in Prescott. This was just 4 years before discovering 2 dead bodies in a big hole. The 1930 census shows him living at Residence 142 on Old Route 66 with his wife and his son George. Although this is 3 years after the discovery of Coconino Caverns, he doesn't list himself as a tourist operator on the employment area. He puts down that he is a merchant of a service station, and the code lists him as employer rather than employee, meaning he's manager, owner, something of that nature. This is probably when this picture was taken. This cylindrical unit behind him certainly looks like some kind of a gasoline pump to me, which at that time were tall and gravity fed. How or when he lost the rights to the Coconino Caverns is unknown. Perhaps he did gamble it away. We know that he shows up in the 1940 census in the Mojave area as a rancher. After that, he migrated back southward, lived out a long life, and died in the Tucson area in 1967. Son George Peck died in Tucson area in 1981. To me, that's pretty clear evidence that neither one of them have anything to do with any goings-on in the caverns. They apparently weren't all that broken up over losing them, and certainly there were no hangings in the Peck family. Subsequently, once the Pecks leave the story, Winston Wright was not the next owner of the caverns. The state of Arizona was. The state apparently took the mining claim back from Peck, perhaps for lack of assessment work, or maybe because of the work that had been done by the Work Projects Administration. Regardless of which it was, in August of 1949, the state of Arizona puts the caverns up for lease. Immediately, a previously unmentioned player, an Edmund H. Cosgrove of Buckeye, steps forth in Superior Court and files a suit to stop the lease, claiming that he has rights to the property until 1952. Perhaps he's the one that managed to get it from Peck. Then, there's no more mention of the caverns until August of 1959, when Winston Wright comes into the picture.
So after they finished building the elevator, the Indian tribe requested that we fill in the hole, because to them it's a burial ground for them. So
Right.
that's why they actually filled it in.
As my team members walk back towards where I am at after that lecture, that original entrance to the caverns, now sealed up, is about 150 feet behind them in this direction. The now existing elevator shaft entrance is just to my left from where I'm standing. The problem is that original entrance was on state property. The new entrance with the elevator shaft that was on Winston Wright's property was on his mining claim, which abutted that property, meaning that Winston Wright effectively stole the caverns from the state when he filled the original opening in. This immediately resulted in criminal charges being filed against Winston, his mother Winifred, and his wife Layla. In addition to the criminal charges, the state filed a $300,000 damage suit, no small amount in 1959, to force the trio to restore the original opening to its original condition. Responding to the state suit in the newspaper, Winston Wright stated that he had to fill in the original hole because it was a public nuisance. So this spot right here is what's left of the original spot where the opening was that Walter Peck stumbled on when he founded the Grand Canyon Caverns. Well, I suppose if this little hole stood in the way of you making a couple of $1 million in tourist revenue, it probably would be a nuisance. This was a big lawsuit, and it would drag on for a year and a half. Far too many records to be reported here. In early 1961, Winston Wright relinquished any interest in the caverns to a land-holding corporation, probably in a plea agreement with the state. The first duties the Arizona-New Mexico Land Development Corporation would do would be to sink money into extending the elevator shaft to its completion, building the curio shop, and existing structures, probably including the bunkhouse. If so, that would mean that the bunkhouse that Winston Wright's oldest son was to have hanged himself in probably was not built at the time that he hanged himself. The holding company would rename the Coconino Caverns the Sipapoo Caverns in honor of the American Indians which occupied the area and of the 2 Indians which were thrown down the shaft originally. Just a few months later, it was renamed once again, this time to Dinosaur Caverns. So much for honoring that Native American Indian tribe. In 1963, during the Cold War, someone came up with the idea of using the caverns to stock civil defense supplies. And that's where all of those barrels and crates came from. They maintain that due to the low humidity, those foods are still edible today. So what about the Wrights? Winston, Winifred, and Layla. What happened to them? Well, Winston and Layla took their royalties and relocated to Reno, Nevada. We find them listed in the telephone book there in the 1970s. They're not there for more than a decade when old Winston finds himself embroiled from the sidelines in another potential fraud case. A church that Winston belongs to makes a mining land grab trying to file mining claims to recover Apache tears, those black obsidian stones which basically have no value. When questioned by the Reno Gazette, Wright calls the stones semi-precious and very definitely worth mining. A spokesman for the BLM suggests that in some cases people file claims to acquire the land at a cheap price. Wow, looks like old habits die hard. As far as kids, Winston's naval admission in 1942 shows he listed his nearest kin as his father, so he was single. It also shows that he stayed in until November of 1945. So even if he met Layla during his tour and they had a child immediately, that child would have been no more than a teenager at the time that the mine was relinquished in 1959. Winston died in 1988 in Reno. His wife Layla had preceded him a year earlier. Their obituaries could not be located. Mother Winifred's obituary, however, can be found when she died years earlier up in Seattle. As far as grandsons are concerned, it shows that she only had one, which was Winston's nephew. It doesn't say anything about grandsons preceding her in death, and that's usually something that's listed in an obituary. Most likely, Winston and Layla did not have any children, which means there was no son to hang himself inside of a bunkhouse that had not been built at the time he did it. That means that this ghost legend is busted. The only other list of deaths that I could find close by to the caverns was a 1974 newspaper article reflecting back 10 years earlier when 4 people had been killed at the airport nearby, in April of 1964. That is, unless you count the times that the elevator stranded people and they wished they were dead.
And
No food and drink beyond this.
he didn't believe in anything like that until he started working here, and now he's a firm believer in ghosts.
Oh, he didn't believe it before?
Yeah, not at all.
We can take the water down there?
Yeah, water's fine.
Okay.
That's a jug.
I've got my things on. I don't know if you're called. I
You guys ready?
forget.
Yep.
Alright, we're going to go down 210 feet, 21 stories. It'll take about 60 seconds to get all the way down to the bottom. We'll come back up and take about 65 because that's how gravity works. They started blasting the elevator shaft in 1959. Took them 2 years and 90 cases of dynamite. Took an additional year to custom build the elevator, make it work properly, go up and down, and it's been working just fine since 1962.
Cool.
I feel so bad for the tour guide, Des. Twice 1 week. One time, a couple customers, they decided they didn't want to be on the tour. They took the elevator back up to the top, forgot to shut the door.
Oh, so
Doors
she
open,
had
they
it.
don't move.
Yeah.
Oh, so if you open that door while it's moving, that's a
Stop.
Yeah,
stop
stops.
switch, yeah.
So she was stuck after
Oh, we're going
Oh,
up.
took us
Now
back
we're
up.
going
I
up.
don't want to go up. I'm
Okay.
not supposed to do that, so don't tell him.
No,
You didn't do nothing
So-
wrong.
Look
Hello.
up. Wow, that's cool. Looks a lot further when you're looking down, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So he dug this hole to get samples to send to the assay office. While he was waiting on the results, it took quite a while because the horse or the car was not very fast in 1927, so Walter panicked. He thought someone else was going to find the hole he found, come down here and steal his riches. So Walter bought 800 acres of land above us to give him the mineral rights to everything down here in the caverns. Smart move. Very smart move. Until 2 weeks later when he got the results back.
Woo! That's very steep.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. Underground emergency shelter food supply. Wow.
1960. A lot of stuff there.
It's probably still good.
Well, it's water, it's stagnant, you know.
I don't know. What's going to get in it? Not mold. There's nothing going to grow in it.
So it's probably
You know?
still good.
I put my water straw in it and drink it easily.
Yeah, I would too.
Call this the mystery room because in 1958 they wanted to know where all the air came from. Because we did not pump the air down here, it's down here completely natural. So they had a bunch of volunteers stand up on the surface. Man came down here with a bunch of red military-grade smoke bombs. He'd pop one off every so often. They'd wait and see if they seen smoke come out of the ground. Well, after 18 hours, the last volunteer got tired, said, "You crazy, there's no red smoke, I'm going home." And it's a good thing they did, because every 2 hours, day and night, he stood down here, popped off a red smoke bomb. At the end of the second week, they got a call from a lady in Supply Falls, curious to know if they knew why there's red smoke coming out of the walls of the Grand Canyon.
Right.
So, mystery solved.
Yeah, 63 miles away.
65, if you get in your car and drive there, it is 40 miles as the crow flies. They say the small spaces, cracks, and tunnels and stuff can be anywhere from a couple hundred to a few thousand miles long, and we don't know because we don't fit in there.
That is cool. To think about.
So how tall is that thing? They found bones down here.
Huh?
They found its bones down here, right?
Yes, sir. She's 15 foot, 4 inches tall.
Oh, is that the one they found here?
Yes, she weighed about 2,000 pounds, only ate vegetables, and was about 1 year old.
So how the hell would she have lived?
She lived, she fell.
Oh my god.
That little girl, she's probably like 13, 14 years old, asked me where Gertie's claw was because it used to be on the wall. I guess they pulled it out after they built the hotel room because, you know, some punk kid's going to come down here and probably take it off the wall.
You know the size, right?
How many millions of dollars
compare
to the pharmaceutical company?
It's like
The original entrance.
work on it, they have to crawl on their bellies and
So this is basically condemned now, right?
that they are holding.
Once our ghost tour guide took the elevator back up, we began to walk the trails, check out the area, see where and how we were going to set the camera equipment up. Well, it's amazing. It's amazing to be down here alone. And it truly was. There's nothing like being by yourselves 180 feet underground in caverns, and you never imagine how dark it could get once you turn the lights out. The obvious place to set up and run the equipment from is in the suite area. You can't use the suite as far as the sleeping accommodations, but there is a stage area that they will let you set up on. What? These caverns are the lengths of 2 football fields back to back. The area required that some of these cameras be set up 100 feet from the control station. During the lights out portion, the only light in the entire cavern was this weak light from the DVR monitor. We ran out video line and set up 6 infrared cameras down the various passageways of the caverns. These cameras would run successively for the next 6 hours. Unfortunately, the audio portion of the DVR glitched out. When audio was picked up, it only picked up during the Ghost Spirit Box session that we were using, and just recorded static. The Spirit Box session yielded no results. After setting up, we rode the elevator back up to the surface. That's one thing about staying in these caverns. There are no restrooms. You want to use the restroom, you get to ride up to the gift shop and ride back down. Yep.
That seemed faster going up than going down.
Yeah. Anybody in here?
We are still dropping. I didn't realize.
Because he was talking to us
Yeah,
during
because
the
he was
tour.
talking. It's a long ways, yeah. It's a long ways down. At least we're not in the Shiloh where it goes to the 11th floor and stops. Upon returning to the caverns, Gene lurked behind to shut off the trail lights. That's one thing, and we'll show you where all the light switches are to the cavern so that you can go into complete darkness. Courtesy of the management, on the stage area that you will set up on, there are a variety of musical instruments that you can play while down in there if you want to hear what they sound like. This is an aftershot of the guitar, which as I recall had 1 string missing, and yet managed to play a most unnatural tune. Jan thought she'd try her hand at trying to compose a song 180 feet underground with a guitar missing a string. She spent a couple of minutes playing with the guitar, so we'll cut right to the point where she stops and puts it back down. On the surveillance time recorded, we can see that she sets the guitar back down at 3:09 and 2 seconds. She then gets up and walks around the stage for the next 36 seconds. Unfortunately, we were using the spirit box during this time frame, and the proximity of the microphone next to the DVR, the only thing that was recorded was the static from the spirit box, and that's unfortunate, because 36 seconds after she put this guitar back down, it played 2 notes by itself. You can see Jan turn her head as she reacts to the 2 notes that the guitar played while it was sitting there alone. Keep in mind that the rest of us are on a stage that is completely black. The only light is infrared. We can't see that she's no longer holding the guitar. Once she calls attention to the fact that she has set the guitar back down, then Gene walks over to check it out. Among the thousands of dust orbs that were recorded, the surveillance unit recorded one possible oscillating frequency orb. This orb seemed to originate from deep inside one of the caverns and come towards the camera. To be branded paranormal, it should have been moving faster. Compare that with this same camera from an hour earlier when the wind topside was very strong. This camera is not pointed towards the elevator bank, but is pointed up one of the tunnels. When they tell you that animals or insects can't get down inside of this caverns, this is evidence that they don't know what they're talking about. Early on in the hunt, the 2 ladies were way in the back of the caverns when they reported that they heard what sounded like a baby crying. But this demonstrates that it could have easily been an animal. Many animals, and even the wind, can mimic human sounds. So, what was our conclusion as to our evidence findings? Well, the surveillance unit running in the bunkhouse while we were down in the caverns only turned up one oddity. When we originally came into the bunkhouse, we started the fireplace, set up the surveillance, made dinner, and then after we left, the fireplace chose to go out on its own. Now, it was quite cold and windy outside, so we can't claim it to be paranormal, but once we came back in and started the fireplace back up, it stayed on for that evening and during the rest of the day until we left. So as far as the bunkhouse, it was none encountered and none recorded. And upon completing the background investigation and busting the hanging by death ghost legend, we don't think there's anything in there. As far as the caverns, the guitar incident was definitely paranormal. No way to get around that one. Musical instruments don't play on their own. The oscillating frequency orb and the sound of the baby crying, just maybes. Interestingly, there is one of those ghost journals that people write in the suite area, and one of the things that other people have reported is the sound of the guitar playing by itself and the sound of a baby crying. The legends of death by hanging in the caverns didn't pan out according to the background investigation. The only 2 deaths that we could find connected with the caverns were the 2 Native Americans whose bodies were thrown down into the cavern shaft in 1918, and if I was returning as an investigator, I would focus on that. I would also go after that guitar with surveillance and audio equipment, as it is a very definite trigger object, and that's a hint for future investigators. With this short investigation, we feel that the activity level in the caverns can be branded as low and sporadic, but it is definitely there. Staying down in the cavern and sleeping in the suite, 180 feet underground in complete darkness, one of the biggest thrills you could ever experience. I highly recommend it. It's about $800 a night, and from what I could see, sleeps 4. Believe it or not, during the summer months, it's all booked up. So if you tend to give it a shot, make your reservations early. During the winter months is when you want to conduct the hunt. That's the time when the suite's not being rented out.